Thank you for joining us for this recorded web workshop. In this session, first presented on October 30th, 2013, the Capstone development team gave a comprehensive overview of the Capstone approach. On August 29th, 2013, the National Archives and Records Administration issued guidance for federal agencies on a simplified approach to managing email. NARA Bulletin 2013-02, guidance on a new approach to managing the billions of email messages that are sent or received by federal agencies. The approach is called Capstone. The Capstone approach to email management helps agencies satisfy requirements in the Managing Government Directive. Specifically, it will help them manage all email records electronically by December 31st, 2016, which is Goal 1.2 of the directive. The bulletin is a culmination of 2 years of research with input from federal agencies. It is designed to preserve permanently valuable email and provide a pathway to dispose of temporary email. It allows agencies to manage email without having to use print and file or click and drag methods for each email message. This session is a comprehensive overview of the Capstone approach. The presenters for this session in order of presentation are Paul Wester, Chief Records Officer for the United States Government, Denise Pullen, who is an Electronic Records Policy Analyst, and the team lead for the Capstone Bulletin Development Team, Sean Curry, who is a Senior Records Analyst in Agency Services in the Office of the Chief Records Officer, and a member of the Capstone Development Team, Hannah Bergman, who is an Assistant General Counsel in the Office of the General Counsel at the National Archives and Records Administration, and Meredith Schreiber, an Appraisal Archivist in the Office of the Chief Records Officer and a member of the Capstone Development Team. Now let's join the session.
And now what I am going to do, I am going to pass it over to Mr. Paul Wester, who will give us an introduction into today and introduce our presenters, and we will get started. So I will pass it over to Mr. Wester.
Thanks, Paulette. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Capstone Training Workshop. I am Paul Wester, the Chief Records Officer for the U.S. Government, and I am thrilled to be here to kick off today's Capstone email training session. As you know, NARA released Bulletin 2013-02, Guidance on a New Approach to Managing Email Records, also known as Capstone, in August. This bulletin has received considerable interest from the federal community as well as from the press and the public. Considering the importance of email management in the federal government today, we at NARA wanted to provide additional information on this bulletin, especially on how it may help federal agencies with email management and complying with Section 1.2 of the Managing Government Records Directive, also known as OMB NARA Memorandum M1218, which requires that all federal email be managed in an electronic format by December 31st, 2016. We designed these sessions to provide additional detail on what Capstone is and tips, suggestions, and resources for federal agencies who may be interested in implementing Capstone at their agency. Before we get started, I want to thank the members of the Capstone development team, many of whom you will hear from today as part of today's session, as well as the many federal agencies who provided feedback and suggestions on the bulletin itself. NARA is committed to providing additional information on Capstone as more agencies become aware of it and what it offers, and as additional resources are developed and as agencies begin adoption. We look forward to working with each of you as you consider implementing Capstone at your own agency. Now I will pass it over to Denise Pullen from the Records Management Policy Team, who will kick off the session.
Thank you, Paul. Okay, well, we're going to bring up the agenda here in just a moment. I think up there. Okay, one more. Okay, as you can all see from the agenda today, we have a pretty full afternoon, and you know, we'll be discussing this new approach to email records, give you ideas about where to start, some of the legal issues, you know, and then some of the specific records management considerations, implementation, how to designate accounts, and things to that effect. As Paulette said early, we will have a time period at the end for questions and answers, so we do recommend that you hold your questions until we get to the very end, and that way you may have some of your questions answered as we go through the presentation. Okay. Now I'll be discussing this new approach to email records and then the bulletin as well, so there's a little bit of overlap, but please bear with us. So the current situation that many agencies face is that very few agencies are managing their email records electronically. There's agencies that do rely on print and file strategies. Some are figuring out ways of bringing in electronic record keeping in some fashion, but nonetheless it is still pretty much a big challenge for people to deal with that. Some agencies use records management applications, the DoD 5015.2 standard certified systems, and while NARA does continue to endorse that standard, and it can be useful depending on the application, it can be no less burdensome than print and file. You may have to click and file, you have to use records control schedule, and try to figure out where things belong and things to that effect. So these problems and many others are leading to a loss of permanent electronic email. And once it's gone, it's gone. So the challenge then that NARA and the federal agency community faces is that, first off, that all federal email must be managed in accordance with the Federal Records Act. Before, you've had to have the user intervention, to be able to file the stuff. You have to retain for as long as required. You have to identify maybe a separate message and file that in some file folder, things to that effect. So there was a big burden on the end user. And there's also this problem of volume of email. That makes compliance very difficult when you've got a flood of email in your email boxes every morning, and then afternoon, evening, etc. So NARA is concerned that ensuring that those emails that are permanent, particularly the clearly permanent emails that are dealing with policy, dealing with agency directions and things like that, how are we going to preserve those and transfer to NARA? How will future researchers be able to use them? Then agencies also have an interest in ensuring that email is kept for the sufficient period of time to conduct their business and then no longer than that. So Paul mentioned the Managing Government Records Directive, and that also had some goals that all federal agencies have to manage all email electronically by December 31st, 2016. And that we were required also, NARA was required to issue guidance by December 31st on managing, disposing, and transferring email. And this Capstone guidance does satisfy that requirement for us. So the solution we came up with was a Capstone concept. And what it does is it does reduce the use of item-by-item filing to make email management easier for end users. It allows agencies to manage email at the account level rather than at the individual message level. Agencies can leverage any existing technology that they're using. They're not required to use any specific technology. That's up to you as agency leaders and everything else. And it also allows for the disposition of those temporary accounts. Anecdotally, we're hearing of hundreds of thousands of accounts in some agencies, and there's no way that they can get rid of them. And at the same time, we identify those permanently valuable email accounts. And just to give you kind of a visual about how it works, is like at the very top of the pyramid that you see here, they're very high-level accounts that may include permanent records. There may be a handful that are excluded from Capstone for whatever business reason the agencies determine. Lower-level accounts are in the kind of pinkish color. Now within that, you see the little red triangles. Well, those would be permanent accounts. So you may have people that are lower in the organization that may need to be appraised as permanent. And that depends on how the agency is structured and agency needs. And off on the sides in the green and blue box may be separate parts of one large agency and things to that effect. So your mileage may vary, but that's kind of like a very quick and dirty overview of the concept. Okay? Okay, now we're moving to the second part of my first presentation, and that's an overview of the Capstone Bulletin. NARA bulletins are a way that NARA communicates policy on records management to federal agencies. And so the Capstone Bulletin indicates that this is not a software approach. It's not a software application, it is an approach. Capstone provides an additional option for managing email records, and it is not mandatory. Agencies may choose not to adopt Capstone if they so desire. Okay. Capstone is flexible, and it allows for various implementation approaches, with the major goal of being able to systematically transfer email accounts that are permanent and dispose of entire email accounts that are temporary. Okay. Also, agencies are allowed to remove transitory, non-record, and/or personal messages from those email accounts. Now, that is up to the agency as well. Some agencies may elect to just, in effect, lock down an account and say, let's keep everything, and other agencies may say, it's time to take the non-records out. You have a 30-day safe harbor period, for instance, to remove stuff that may be personal. And the whole idea is that the work of the user determines the status of that account. So that is another agency decision that would be made along the way, which we will cover in depth later on. Okay. So the first part of the bulletin, that number there in the upper corner, number 1, says that actually corresponds to the numbers in the bulletin. So what is the purpose of this bulletin? It lays out NARA's new approach and its relationship to the Presidential Memorandum and on the Managing Government Records Directive. Okay. Then what is the Capstone approach? It is that simplified approach I mentioned earlier, based on the work or position of the account holder. Capstone accounts are scheduled as permanent, all other accounts are temporary, and that agencies may remove transitory, non-record, and or personal messages depending on their needs. So the third part, the Capstone approach, may provide a practical approach to managing legacy email accounts. We do believe it will cut down on print and file and other related approaches, although there may be needs for agencies to maintain that and for certain records. It will, we believe, capture permanent email for transfer to NARA in electronic format, and it also leverages existing technologies that agencies may use to meet their own goals in the directive. So what should an agency consider before using it? The bulletin asks a list of questions that agencies should think about. It's not necessarily a checklist, but it is something to take under consideration. If an agency decides to use a Capstone approach, they must determine which accounts they want to designate as permanent and schedule or apply any existing authorities, disposition authorities that they may find. And agencies are encouraged to consult with a NARA appraisal archivist to help determine the appropriate strategy for managing their records. So, and in the fifth part of the bulletin, does Capstone change agencies' record-keeping responsibilities? Well, agencies still have record-keeping responsibilities when it comes to email. We do believe, and I want to emphasize this, we do believe it can reduce the burden on the end users of the email accounts. But agencies still must schedule records, and you may be able to submit a Capstone schedule. You must protect the integrity and authenticity of the records throughout their entire life cycle, maintain access and usability, again, through their entire life cycle. Determine if email records should be filed with any related records. There may be case files or something that you have to maintain. Depends on agency needs. And also capture and maintain metadata so that you can find the records again and you know what they are and that they are what they say they are. Okay. So how do agencies identify the Capstone accounts? This is all based on agency business processes. You guys know your work better than we do, so you'd have to determine that and figure out those processes that create or receive permanently valuable email. It does not have to be limited to high-level agency officials. Most likely, many of your officials will be considered Capstone, depending on your organization, but be sure to look down further in the organization to determine if they also need to be Capstoned. We do list a number of sources for possible officials, such as the Plum Book, the U.S. Government Manual. It does not require to use either one. You also may want to use your organizational charts and various other things. The bulletin asks the questions that must agencies use a specific technology to implement Capstone? No, it is not dependent on any specific technology. If you want to use a Microsoft Outlook, you can do that and send us PST files. If you want to use an email vault of some sort, you may also do that. And also agencies can leverage any existing technologies they have. And we do recommend strongly that agencies have policies, procedures, and training in place to fully implement Capstone so that people understand what they're doing. So does NARA's pre-accessioning policy apply? Yes, it does. NARA accepts records before the retention schedule is up, and they remain in NARA's physical custody, but your legal custody. So you can do that with these email accounts. Okay. Now, we do, in the bulletin, include a list of other resources that are available to you. I want to just do a shout out to Records Express. That's our blog for the Office of the Chief Records Officer here at NARA. There's a toolkit for managing electronic records. So those sources are available. Okay. Finally, the last piece on the bulletin is whom should I contact for more information? And again, it's your NARA's appraisal archivist. And the bulletin has a link to help you find those fine folk, two of which are sitting here. And with that, I am going to turn over to Section 3, Where to Start, presented by Sean Curry.
Thank you, Denise. My name is Sean Curry, and I'm an appraisal archivist here at the National Archives and also a member of the Capstone development team. And you're going to hear from me a few times today during the presentation. And now that Denise has covered the bulletin itself and what points it covers, we want to really spend the rest of the presentation going into more detail about what those points mean and give you some suggestions and ideas for how you can get started when it comes to Capstone. So the first section we have is called Where to Start, because we literally want to start answering the now what question. Now that the bulletin has been released, now that it's live and could be used by agencies, what do we recommend you do first? And with any new initiative or any major change in your records management program, we recommend you start with some planning and brainstorming, and that's what we're going to talk about in this section. So part of this literally begins with agencies discussing if Capstone is right for them. As the bulletin says, and Denise mentioned earlier, it's not mandatory. So part of the discussion within your agency is going to be whether or not Capstone will make your management of email better. And part of this is going to be looking at it in regards to the presidential directive that was mentioned earlier, which does require that email be managed in electronic format by December 31st of 2016. Part of these early discussions may also include talking about or determining the resources and tools available to assist with decision making. A lot of your resources or tools, your plans for future email technologies, for example, may affect or direct some of your decisions, and we're going to talk about that in more detail later. And very important, you want to determine the stakeholders needed for Capstone discussions and decisions. This is not just a records management issue. You're going to be hearing later on about how general counsel should be involved, how your IT staff should be involved, and we're going to give you some other suggestions for how to take the team approach when you're talking about whether Capstone is a good fit for your agency and at what level. So we at the National Archives, specifically those of us on the Capstone development team, really wanted to try to come up with some tools that may assist you with some of these early conversations. And one of the handouts that is available to you on the link that Paulette shared earlier is what we call a Capstone planning checklist. And this is nothing formal. It's not due back to NARA. It's designed to be a guide to walk you through a lot of what we're going to be discussing today. Some of those key points that we think you should be focusing on when making decisions about Capstone, how it can best be implemented at your agency, etc. So when you get back to your offices or when you have time to actually download this from our website, you can take a look at this and it hopefully will give you a place to start. As I mentioned, this is not a formal form. You can change it to meet your needs. You can add to it. You can tweak it. You can really make it useful for you when having your early Capstone discussions. For example, the first part of the checklist recommends that the first step an agency should take is an assessment or an evaluation of your agency's current email management program. Ask such questions as, what are our agency's email management practices and policies right now? What is our email platform and storage capacity? What records management challenges has this agency experienced? In other words, we're asking the question, is our current email management solution working? Whether it's print and file, whether it's some other format, is it working for your agency? Do you feel that users are adequately managing their email? Other factors that we're going to delve into more detail later are the legal issues. Those of you that have classified email may have other issues to discuss. And of course, you may want to talk about your future IT and budget resources. For example, if you know that your agency will be switching to a new email platform, that might be the perfect time to talk about whether a Capstone approach will work for you and can be aligned with that new technology. So you may get to a point where after looking at this question on the checklist, that your email is already being managed and you're already in compliance with a presidential directive. If that's the case, that's great. But we believe that for a lot of agencies out there, email is not being managed properly. And Capstone, which we're going to talk about in a lot of detail today, will give you a new method of managing email so you are in compliance with the directive. So that brings us to the bottom line. Does your agency's current email solution meet the requirements of M1218, Section 1.2 of the Presidential Directive, which requires that all emails are managed in an electronic format by the end of 2016? If the answer is no, and we believe that will be the answer for a lot of agencies, you then ask the question, can Capstone help? And today's session is really geared at that question, where we can give you more information about Capstone, give you examples of Capstone, so you can determine whether Capstone will be a good fit for your agency, at what level, what other implementation steps you need to take, etc. So the second part of the checklist, and this is very important, is getting the right people involved in the conversation. As I mentioned, this is not just a records management issue. There are a lot of different stakeholders who should be involved in the conversations from the beginning. And we have some recommendations as a place to start. You'll see at the top of the list the Senior Agency Official for Records Management. As you're probably aware, the directive also requires that every federal agency appoint a Senior Agency Official for Records Management who can assist with getting a team set up, resources, they have visibility throughout the department or agency, and they can really give you that management support that is needed to move forward. Obviously, the agency records officer should be involved. That is usually the person who's involved with general records management policy, training, implementation, etc. For some of you, you may want to get your departmental records officer involved. A lot of components or operatives of larger cabinet departments, for example, may share an email platform with their department. If that's the case, you're going to want to make sure you're having these conversations at a wider, higher level. Very important is Chief Information Officer IT staff. They will be the ones who can tell you what your current email technology is, whether or not it's capable of being altered or used to support a Capstone approach where email is managed at that account level. And we're going to talk more about that in detail coming up. General counsel, FOIA privacy program representatives. I always like to say that records management is risk management. There's a whole legal end to it. It's really for your own protection to properly manage your records. And we're going to have a section later where we get into more information about what the role of your general counsel may be. But it's highly recommended that they be involved in the conversations from day one. Other stakeholders may include your NARA appraisal archivist. They can keep you up to date on what other agencies are doing, what other tools or ideas we might have about Capstone, and generally keep you abreast of things that are changing. And of course, your agency may have other stakeholders that we have not identified. You, as the professionals within your agency, will know the proper people who should come to the table. So the list we have here is just a place to start, some suggestions of those folks that we think will be very, very helpful in getting you the information to begin talking about Capstone. So what are these stakeholders going to do? Part of it is that you have to make sure they're informed on what the Capstone approach is. And that's one of the reasons why we developed this PowerPoint, this class, and a lot of the handouts that you're going to see today. If they're informed on what Capstone is, they can then assist with the current program assessment, answering the question of whether or not your email management program is working. They can discuss the appropriate implementation approach for your agency. One of the big themes we're going to cover today is that because Capstone is an approach, it's a method, there is no one-size-fits-all. So every agency may, in a sense, develop their own individual unique Capstone approach. Your stakeholders can have the conversation as to what that approach may look like. Part of that is developing an implementation plan. We're going to talk later about the role of policy and training, etc. And your stakeholders, of course, can identify available technologies, tools, resources. As I mentioned before, your email management system, the platform you have now, may very easily be adaptable to support a Capstone approach, where you can program in that certain accounts are permanent versus temporary. And again, we'll talk more about that later. But the bottom line here is it's imperative to have the right people involved early on in the conversations. So Denise shared with you earlier a visual of what Capstone looks like, the pyramid approach. And we also tried to come up with a visual that might capture the entire world of Capstone, all the various possibilities that can be done under Capstone. And we realized quickly that that's kind of impossible. There's not one visual that can really show what every type of Capstone approach would look like. But we wanted to at least come up with a visual that will show you the basics of what the average Capstone approach, the average Capstone method would look like. And this is also one of the handouts that is available to you online. So if we take a look at the top of the chart, all Capstone approaches are going to start in the same place. This is going to be a constant, and that is when email is sent or received. So you have your email platform, email is coming in, it's going out, just like we have it today. Now, in the world of Capstone, however, there's going to be a lot of different policy decisions that your agency is going to have to make. And these decisions may be based on your legal needs, your technology limitations, or a lot of other factors that we're going to talk about today. So the yellow triangles that we see here, the diamonds, are really getting into the whole idea of policy. And this is where Capstone is really going to vary from agency to agency. For example, is there an opportunity for culling, for removing non-record transitory information? And we're going to have a whole section devoted to that question later today. The other question, is there a need to place the email in a case file or subject file? The whole idea of cross-filing. As Denise mentioned, the bulletin states that this does not alleviate other records management requirements. So part of the conversation is going to be, at what level will your agency have to deal with cross-filing, etc.? That's going to bring us back to policy decisions. Now ultimately, when we get to the bottom of our chart, it's going to bring us back to another constant. Regardless of what your policies are in place, Capstone is always going to lead us to a place where the email that is left is officially captured. And that's what we see here in the blue box on the left. And this means that the official record-keeping version of all email is now captured, whether that's your live system or an email vault or some other repository. You are now declaring that the official record-keeping version of all email. That is one of the fundamentals of Capstone. And that also is telling us that it's going to be maintained electronically, thus it's in compliance with the directive. Now from there over to the right, we really get to the bones of Capstone. This is the big change in the management of email. Because as Denise said, we are now allowing email to be managed not based on content per se, but based on the work and or the position of the account user. And essentially we are turning email into its own record series or a few different record series. And in the visual we have here, you'll see that we essentially have two buckets of email. We have all the email that belongs to permanent accounts, which will eventually be transferred to the National Archives. And below that, we have the bucket of all the other email, the email that does not rise to the importance of permanent and therefore is temporary and may be destroyed at a certain point. So again, that's the bones of Capstone. Email becomes a record series. It's now able to be managed as a record series, which we believe will greatly increase the manageability of email in federal agencies. And later on in the presentation, we're going to go into more detail on, for example, how to designate the permanent accounts, how to talk about what length of time is appropriate for temporary accounts, and what needs to be done in terms of scheduling, etc. Later on, I'm also going to share with you a graphic that is very similar to this one, but goes into more detail on a real live Capstone scenario, where we can literally go through the process of what is happening to email in a scenario that we believe some agencies may be using. So you'll see this visual again later with some more detail. But before then, I'm now going to turn it over to Hannah Bergman, who is going to talk to you about some of the legal issues that go along with Capstone and the role of your general counsel.
Hi, everyone. As Sean said, my name is Hannah Bergman. I work in the General Counsel's Office here at the National Archive. And I was part of the team that helped draft this bulletin. And the first thing that we want to encourage, that my office wants to encourage, is that is collaboration among other offices, so that records managers reach out to their general counsel's office, to their CIO's office, and really think about sort of agency-wide consequences to implementing this policy, because there are a lot of balls in the air when you're doing this sort of big policy change that you need to think about that have legal implications and IT implications. And I'm here today to help sort of tee up what some of those legal issues might be for the attorneys that you talk to, so that you have it, questions and answers in your head. You understand what types of issues that they might be thinking about. So attorneys tend to worry about everything, right? That's what we do. We are paid lots of money to do that. So I think the big thing here is that this is an answer to a question, right? Many agencies have come to the archives for several years and said, what do we do with emails? Agency attorneys call our office and say, please, we want to dispose of this email, we need to search this email, how do we do this? So the Capstone approach is an answer to that question, which is really exciting from our standpoint. And it also means that we have a way to meet the 2016 directive. So the key aspect of the Capstone approach is that it minimizes the burden on individual users and essentially automates the management of the email records. So it's important that everyone consider all the factors sort of on how an agency implements it to make it work best for themselves, but we think it's the easiest and the cheapest way to go, basically. So what are attorneys in your agency across the board probably going to be worried about? They're probably going to be worried about making sure an agency designates a sufficient number of Capstone officials to ensure that there's adequate preservation of the permanent records, how they implement the Capstone approach for temporary records, and how they document the decision-making process, right? I think the biggest thing here is making sure that there are documents that sort of outline the process and the thinking behind why some accounts are permanent, why other accounts aren't, why you're drawing the lines where you are. It's important that you be able to defend that attorneys be able to defend any policy that the agency puts in place, and the best defense and the best way that anyone can sort of figure out how you arrived at a decision is by documenting that decision. So other common legal concerns, and this sort of goes to the preservation issue, is making sure that thinking about what groups of records would have been preserved under a non-Capstone approach that are now not there, and then the inverse of that, right? So what are you going to have that you wouldn't have had before? Those questions are going to come up, and they're going to have practical effects when you're thinking about writing regulations, when you're thinking about public policy aspects, litigation issues, access requests. What if you get a congressional request for records that that in a pre-Capstone world you wouldn't have had, but now that you've implemented a Capstone approach, you have those records. So you're going to need to be able to search them, review them, produce them. All those things happen now. And so a few other questions that they're also likely to have. How are the agencies going to be able to implement a litigation hold under the Capstone framework? If you're capturing all the email that's going in and out of your door, you're going to need to be able to make sure that you're disposing of certain things in response to, their non-record, their temporary records, they're ready for disposition, but you're also able to stop that process and make sure those records aren't destroyed in the event that you need to implement a litigation hold. And that's going to be very dependent on what technology you use within your agency to implement the Capstone approach and how sort of it all works out, whether or not you do it on a live system or many of the other technical ideas that we have for implementing that we'll get to later in the presentation. E-discovery and FOIA are also going to be big issues for how records are searched and how they're produced. And then we also want to make sure that when you delete records, that you do it pursuant to the schedule, that it's a defensible deletion, right? Capstone is going to get you, a lot of the way toward dealing with these problems. I think every general counsel's office is probably going to say that, oh, we need to think about, different policies in terms of litigation holds and production requests, so that the little gaps that exist between a Capstone implementation and legal obligations are filled in, and those gaps and sort of what sort of bridge policies you need will really depend on how your agency is structured and the technology you use. And of course, we always encourage everyone to reach out to the Justice Department when there are questions about litigation, particularly discovery issues. So now I'm going to turn it over to Meredith for Section 6, Section 5. Yep. Yeah.
Section 5.
Section
Thank
5.
you, Hannah. I am Meredith Schreiber, and I'm an appraisal archivist here at NARA, and I'm a member of the Capstone development team. And I am going to talk with you guys about Capstone approach scope. And so at this point, as an agency, you would have determined that, you're going to do Capstone. You should have talked with your stakeholders, and you should be aware of any concerns and issues that you might have. And now you're really ready to design your implementation approach. And the first piece to designing your implementation approach is really determining your scope. So before we get too far into the topic of scope, there is one key point that I want you all to keep in mind during your scope determination, and that's really that the Capstone approach, as already mentioned, is really incredibly flexible, and it really allows each agency to develop a different implementation plan that is based on their own business and legal needs. And this flexibility extends to the level of your implementation or your scope. And one final point to make as it relates to your Capstone approach scope is that the broader your Capstone scope, the more likely that you're going to meet compliance with the Managing Government Records Directive. So keep that in mind. So the discussion on scope can really be broken up into two pieces or decisions. You have decision 1, which is really kind of a high-level decision, and then you have decision 2, which is really refining points or limitations to your high-level decision, kind of depending on how you want to look at it. So if we want to look at decision 1, we have the approach applies to the entire agency, and then we also have or the approach applies to only specific offices and or regions. You might decide to pick one of these over the others for various reasons. Depending on your agency's organizational structure, you may find that one is more beneficial or easier to implement. You may have resource issues or you have budget issues, and so you might pick one or the other. Maybe your technology. Maybe it's possible that in your regions you're using a different technology, and so you might find that you would pick one of these over the other. So if we look at decision 2 for our refining points or our limitations, there are some additional things to think about that you might want to apply to your scope. And so we have the approach applies to only legacy email accounts. Maybe you're really happy with how your current email management is going, but you have these legacy email accounts that you're not really sure what to do with, or you haven't really come up with a good solution, so you only want to do Capstone for your legacy accounts. Alternately, you could say the approach applies to only day-forward email accounts. Maybe you don't have legacy email accounts, or maybe you've already dealt with those legacy email accounts, but day-forward, you definitely are excited about Capstone and you want to move forward. Another consideration is does this approach apply to a specific email platform or email archiving solution? You may find that your current platform just doesn't maybe work well with Capstone. Maybe it would take a lot to configure it, or it would take extra money and you're just not sure if it can work. Maybe you decide that you want to implement it using a new platform going forward. Maybe you have some legacy accounts that you can't configure. So you definitely want to think about that and how that might come into play with your scope decisions. And then lastly, you could decide that your approach applies to your legacy, all your email platforms, and day-forward email accounts, and keep it all inclusive. One thing to keep in mind, however, when you're making these decisions is that there could be ramifications or considerations based on your scope decision. So, for example, if we look at the first sub-bullet, we've got limiting Capstone to day-forward email only, then that means that an agency has to come up with an alternate process for the management of their legacy email. So it's really just the idea that if you're going to have more than one system in place, you need to make sure that you have other processes set up for your other emails. All right, now given a lot of the points that we've already discussed, and I think we have actually alluded to it a little bit in a previous slide, NARA is going to suggest that you at least consider the largest scope possible for your Capstone approach. And so this means that your approach applies to the entire agency, and your approach applies to both legacy and day-forward email accounts. This being said, NARA definitely fully acknowledges that agencies may have valid reasons for having a more limited scope than this. As I've mentioned before, you might have technology reasons or resource concerns or other issues that it just isn't possible. But one thing to also consider is that an agency could have a phased approach to their Capstone scope. So you could start with just a couple small offices, maybe in your headquarters. Once you get your implementation rollout good and it's moving smoothly, then you could expand it to include all of headquarters. And once that's running smoothly, then you could expand it and include all of your regional offices. So there's nothing that says that the scope you start with is the scope that you end with. And all of those scenarios are acceptable under the Capstone approach because it is such a flexible approach. All right, and that actually takes us to the end of our discussion on scope, and so I'm going to turn it back over to Sean Curry for implementation factors.
No, you were going to turn it over to Denise.
Whoops.
That's all right.
Sorry.
Anyway, so Section 6, Implementation Factors. I am Denise Poland, and if I didn't mention before, I'm the Electronic Records Policy Analyst here at NAR, one of the 6 or 7. And anyway, we'll go on to the next slide. Okay, so the implementation factors. Now, we've identified 4 different groupings of technology, of implementation factors. The first one's technology, then policy factors, training and awareness, and stakeholder input. So for technology, we recommend that agencies review your current IT capabilities, including your email systems, any email archives, and everything else that you have. There's going to be certain questions that the agency will need to answer and identify. One of them is that can your current capabilities, can the technology you're using, separate accounts by the user or the office? Can you update account information when the staff changes? That can be critical because staff often changes. Coming and going, getting new jobs, promotions, demotions, everything else. Can you separate and flag permanent and temporary accounts? Can you dispose of temporary accounts? Are they kind of locked into the system and you can't pull them out? And finally, can you transfer permanent accounts to NARA? Can you bring those over to us in a format that we can accept? And we will accept most email formats. And you also have to take a look at what capabilities can be automated and if any must be done manually, and then keep those into account. And it may help you decide if you need new technology or not, and then go from there. Okay. Then another group of implementation factors revolves around policy. We do believe that agencies may need to create and issue policies for the Capstone approach. How much oversight does your agency need? You know, how many people do you have? You know, what's the span of control for the various managers, things to that effect. Will your agency allow staff to call transitory personnel or other non-records? And you have to understand that there'll be ramifications and issues with leaving everything in there as well, particularly personal records. When will the permanent accounts be captured for preservation? At what point do you cut off and freeze the accounts? What are your current agency policies on personal use of email accounts? Particularly when these things may be preserved, it may be a good opportunity to review those policies and strengthen them as needed. Then what are your current agency policies on the use of email accounts to conduct agency business? Do you allow multiple accounts for people? Do you allow alias accounts? Do you allow people to use a personal account, maybe only in the case of emergency, or maybe there may be other circumstances that you have to? So those are just some of the policy things that you need to take a look at. Then training and awareness. The level of training varies depending on your Capstone's approach. Now, for a lot of end users, this will be completely transparent. They may need just be told that there's such a policy in place, but others are going to need some training. So the end users would need to be trained on how to implement the agency's Capstone approach. They need to understand the personal use of email, and they need to understand agency email management policies. So those, I think, are the two things at the very least. But your IT staff and your records management staff, they may need some additional training that you would need to identify. And again, you can consult with the appraisal archivist and things like that to help determine the specific type of trainings. Okay. And finally, stakeholder input. Sean earlier mentioned that there's a number of stakeholders from this senior agency official, the attorneys and everything else. So be sure that you, during the implementation, that you keep all your stakeholders involved throughout the planning and implementation. There may be something that comes up that your general counsel needs to take a look at in the middle of the implementation. There may be something IT that nobody thought about until such time as the users start using it. So be sure to keep them involved. And now I'm going to go over and turn it over to Sean Curry.
Great. Thank you, Denise. Sean Curry again, appraisal archivist here at the National Archives. And we wanted to have a section devoted to specific records management considerations, simply because this was one of the more common questions we got during development. Simply put, the question of how does Capstone relate to, affect, overlap, or change traditional records management? And prior to Capstone, the expectation, as we mentioned earlier, was that end users were going email by email, making record, non-record decisions, and then applying various disposition authorities against the record email. And as you've learned today, Capstone now allows you the option of managing the email as its own larger record series, rather than doing that item by item, email by email designation. So because of that major change, we need to talk a little bit about how does this really change traditional records management above and beyond that. So one of the first topics here, and you might remember this from the first section when we talked about the bulletin, is that cross-filing and linking of email may still be a requirement depending on the business and legal needs of your agency. But this can be done in several ways. A lot of agencies, for example, can use electronic pointers such as metadata tags to establish linkage so that you know a specific email relates to, say, a case file or a subject file that is managed elsewhere. Now, a lot of agencies right now, including the National Archives, have a policy of print and file. If you have an email that relates to a specific case file, you will literally print it out and put it into that case file. That may still be a situation you have to do under a Capstone approach. Now, for some end users, they may never have email that needs to be associated with another record, but others, such as those agencies that are very heavy in case files or subject files, may need to put a lot of thought into this requirement. How are they going to deal with it? Does their technology allow them to still do this? Will their policies dictate that users still do this? And you're going to see more about this when I get to the visual at the end of this section. The other question that comes around regarding records management is, what is the role of the end user? As I mentioned, under traditional records management, the end user usually had to make the record, non-record decisions for each email. But within a lot of federal agencies, that simply hasn't been happening. So the goal of Capstone is to take the burden off of the end user, to allow us a more systematic, consistent way of applying disposition to email. Because right now, email is just building up and building up and building up and building up, and it becomes more and more impossible or burdensome to go through and apply disposition. But if you're going to change over to a Capstone approach, you still need to have the conversation about what are you going to allow that end user to do. And this brings us back to one of the big themes of today, which is that Capstone is flexible. And depending on your technology, depending on your legal concerns, you may end up saying that your end users will have no involvement in these decisions, or like you'll see later in my example, your end user may still have an opportunity to apply some traditional records management before Capstone kicks in. So this brings us to a topic known as culling. That's a fancy way of basically saying removal, the removal of non-record personal material. So we define culling as any activity, whether automated or manual, that removes non-record and/or transitory material from an email account. And this usually would occur before official capture. We at NAR are encouraging culling, especially when automated, to reduce capture of non-record and transitory material. But at the same time, we're acknowledging that some technology may not allow that. So that brings us back to the flexibility. Some agencies may be able to automate the removal of personal and non-record material, others might not. And again, I'll show you an example of this in a few slides. Now, it's also important to remember that agencies must not remove email that is considered a record unless it is filed elsewhere. So culling should enhance the accessibility and usefulness of the complete record. So an example here, let's say that your policy does allow users to still cull removed material. What type of policies or training are you going to have in place to make sure they're doing that correctly, that they're not removing actual record material that should be captured? It's another question to add to the list when it comes to Capstone. So when we talk about culling, there are a lot of options, and we're going to talk about the ones we've identified as probably the most common that might be available depending on different technologies. The first one is automated culling. This is an activity that does not require end user action. For example, this could be deduplication tools, which might be software that's operating behind the scenes that can detect email blasts and other duplicated email and therefore classify it as non-record. There may be non-record categorization behind the scenes rules. For example, you may be able to program into your email platform that all email from a specific domain, such as a listserv, are identified automatically as non-record. Or there may be other behind-the-scenes rules that assist with email categorization. For example, where you can program in the email addresses of your family and friends so that anything from or to that email address is automatically categorized as a personal item. So again, automated culling is greatly suggested to enhance Capstone if your technology allows it. Because again, we acknowledge that not all email platforms will allow this type of activity. Now on the other side, we have manual culling. This is any activity that does require some form of end user action. This may be a period of time, sometimes known as a safe harbor, where users are allowed to manually make record, non-record categorization before official capture. So in a way, you are allowing a period of time where traditional records management can be applied before official capture. Some users may take advantage of that safe harbor period, some may not, but it still allows for some management of email in a traditional sense. Now, we also think that a lot will look at kind of a hybrid, where there are the automated rules behind the scenes that are making record, non-record decisions on your behalf based on pre-programmed rules. And there may also still be an opportunity for manual safe harbor, etc. And then finally at the bottom, we have no culling at all. Now this is probably the least preferred because this means you may be capturing and managing non-record and personal material. But again, some technology may literally only allow capture at the exact moment of creation or receipt, in which case your Capstone approach means you're going to be managing bodies of email that may include items that would traditionally be considered non-record, personal, etc. So when we talk about culling, and if you have a technology that does not allow culling, it's important to know that the agency is accepting a few things. In this scenario, all content, including personal in an email account, could end up being treated as a record. Since now we're looking at the email or the body of email as a record series, it's going to include everything if you're not able to cull. That also means that all content in the email accounts designated as permanent would be transferred to the National Archives. So this brings us back to what Denise spoke about earlier, the policies on the use of email for personal reasons. Is this okay with your agency from a legal end? What other routes can you take to reduce the amount of personal information that may accidentally be captured as permanent? So again, we are recommending culling to the highest extent possible. And this is another reason why your IT folks are going to be very beneficial, because they will be able to tell you what your email system can do now in terms of automated rules, etc. We at the National Archives still think that even with these accepting points, that Capstone is still better. Because number one, we're already getting personal material that is being transferred to the archives, and at least Capstone does give you a disposition date for a certain point. Right now, email is building up and building up and building up with no disposition at all, and under a Capstone approach, at least you will have authority to delete, dispose of those records at a certain point. So with that, let me show you another visual. This is similar to the one I showed you earlier, but it's going to go into more detail. It's going to be a real Capstone scenario. Now, in this scenario here, the agency has decided to apply Capstone across the board. It's for the entire agency. So we're not talking about multiple platforms. We're talking about one platform for the entire agency. So when we look at the top of the visual, similar to the one we saw earlier, we start with email being sent or received. Now, the policy of this particular agency is that everything that comes in or goes out defaults to a federal record. It is assumed to be a federal record, unless something in the purple boxes happens and tells it otherwise. And this is where the policies come into play, and this is where the ability of the technology comes into play. For example, for the first one here, this scenario has automated rules, the actions that happen behind the scenes without the user even knowing it, where some records are recategorized as a non-record and or transitory. That might be all emails from a specific listserv, a specific domain, those that are determined to be email blasts, etc. So in this scenario, we already have some non-record material being identified for culling. Now below that, the policy in this example also allows for that safe harbor period, the time when the user can also make record, non-record decisions. This is in addition to what's happening automated. So the user could still find an email and say, this is personal, or this is not a record, or this is transitory. And each user may do this differently. Some may be very good at making record, non-record decisions. Others may not at all. Then finally below that, we have the important step of other manual actions where the user associates the email with other related records, such as a case file or a subject file. I'm going to give you a real example here using myself. As an appraisal archivist at the National Archives, I am not a senior official. So if we go the route of Capstone, my email is going to be temporary. But I still produce a very small volume of permanent email. Specifically, when I'm working on a schedule or an appraisal job for an agency, I create what is known as a dossier, which is the same thing as a case file, where all the interaction with the agency, including email about that specific schedule, gets filed. And that dossier, that case file, is a permanent record. So under my policy at the National Archives, I am still required to print that email and file it into that case file. Now with me, the benefit is that the other 99.9% of my email, which is not permanent, will ultimately be disposed according to a Capstone schedule, rather than just building up, since I'm one of those users who's not very good at making record, non-record decisions or going through email by email to determine what disposition is. So finally at the bottom here, after we have all the purple areas, and that's the flexibility of Capstone depending on your policies, we finally get to the point where any remaining email in the system is officially captured. Now in this scenario, we end up then with the official capture, which is the box in the middle, that's red, the official record-keeping version of all email, which is captured and stored. Now, under this scenario, there's going to be programmed in whose accounts are permanent and whose accounts are temporary based on a disposition schedule, which in itself was based on the role of the person whose email account that was. As I mentioned, I'm not going to have a permanent account, but the Archivist of the United States and other policymakers will. So this brings us back to the two buckets we saw earlier. Those accounts that have been designated as permanent will eventually come to the National Archives. Those that have been designated as temporary, such as mine, will eventually be disposed of. And this will be just like any other record series out there. There's going to be cutoff instructions, such as at the end of the year or the fiscal or calendar year, and then there's going to be disposition instructions. For example, maybe mine will be that my account can be destroyed 7 years after the end of the calendar year in which the email was received or sent. So this is going to give blanket disposition to that body of email based on the user, based on the account, rather than based on the content of email. So just to give you an idea, this example I showed you here is what we at the National Archives as an agency are going to be adopting. We as a federal agency, just like you, we have to manage our business email. So we've been looking into Capstone to solve our problems, and we are going to have a situation that looks like this, where we're going to have policies that allow for that automated detection. We're going to allow for a period of safe harbor where users can still make decisions, and we're still going to have those occasions, and for some people it will be rare, where we have to cross-file email. But ultimately, anything that's left is going to be captured and managed in one of those Capstone buckets, whether permanent or temporary. Now, you'll hear more about this later, but early next year, 2014, we're going to have the National Archives staff, the people from our records management, general counsel, etc., talk to you in detail about our own Capstone approach. So you're going to be getting a lot more detail about what we at the National Archives are doing for Capstone. That'll kind of expand on what we're talking about today. So one of the things you see here is the permanent accounts that come to NARA. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Meredith Schreiber, who's going to talk to you about just how are we going to determine which accounts are permanent.
Thank you, Sean. And as Sean mentioned, the next section that we're going into is titled Designated Accounts. And I know that for many of you, this is probably the million-dollar question, and it's the question that maybe you most want answered because maybe you really don't understand how you're supposed to go about doing this. Well, I'm hoping that at the end of this section that this will be clearer. So before we go into how we want to, or how you might go about designating accounts, there are a couple points that I want to reiterate that we said earlier. And the main one is that Capstone really relies on identifying entire accounts based on an account owner's role as either permanent or temporary. So you definitely want to keep that in mind. It's on the role or position of a person in the agency. And then the other point that I want to kind of reiterate is that it's the responsibility of the agency to identify these accounts. So NARA certainly wants to work with you if you have questions or concerns, but ultimately it's up to the agency to identify who these accounts, what these accounts are. So that being said, there are several resources and tools that are readily available for agencies to use and to help them in this process. So a really good place to start is to look at the top tiers of your agency, or the group of people that you might call your senior officials. And because these are the people at kind of the top of the agency, it's likely that permanent records that are at lower levels, that they will funnel up to these. these people or to these offices, and it's also likely that they already have a lot of maybe permanent records, or a lot of their records are already scheduled as permanent. And so, so if we want to look at the list of people that we have on the slide, and we actually took this from the bulletin. Senior officials might include, the heads of the departments or independent agencies. This would include their deputies and assistants. It would be possibly the directors of offices or bureaus, political appointees, and it might also include staff assistants to any of these officials, which might be special assistants, confidential assistants, and administrative assistants. That all being said, all those categories of people that I just mentioned, I realize that this might still seem really vague for some of you. If you have a really large agency, you might actually still have a really large pool of people that you're not really sure who really needs to be a permanent account and who maybe really doesn't. Alternately, if you're a small agency or maybe a commission even, maybe this actually wouldn't be that hard. And so maybe by looking at the previous slide, some of those types of people, it would actually be really easy for you to figure this out. But for those of you where you're still really not sure, we've got listed some resources that you can use, and that should help you to narrow down or maybe even populate a list of your capstone officials. And so we have the Federal Government Plum Book, we've got the U.S. Government Manual, your own agency's organizational chart, your agency's delegations of authority, possibly your agency's orders of succession, and an additional one that we actually don't have on the slide is your organic statutes. And you might need to talk to your general counsel about your orders of succession or your organic statutes if you're not familiar with them. But what you really want to do with these resources is to look at each resource and see who they mention in them as your officials. And then you want to evaluate them against each other, who overlaps and who doesn't. Based on what you know about your agency's role and mission and business, is someone missing? Or alternately, are there people who are included that you don't think should be included? And so this is really easy to kind of talk about, out loud, but what does this really look like on paper? And so we actually have an illustration where we actually use NARA as an example, and we're using 4 of the resources from the previous slide, and we kind of arranged them in a Venn diagram, and we've filled in some of our officials that this would pull up, and we have the numbers for how many additional people that there would be. And so when you look at this diagram and you look at that very center piece where all 4 of these resources overlap, you can see that NARA has 3 officials. We have the Archivist of the United States, we have our Chief Strategy and Communications Officer, and our Chief Operating Officer. So if NARA was doing this process, which we in fact currently are in the process of doing this, we might say, well, since all 3 of those positions overlapped through all of these great resources, we can probably assume that maybe all 3 of those people should be included in our capstone account list. Then if you want to move around the diagram, you can say, well, how many additional people do we have that overlap 3 of these? And if you can see on the lower right, there are 7 additional officials. And at this point, maybe you'd start evaluating a little more, and you'd say, well, I know what this person does, and I know what their role is within the agency. I definitely agree that they should be included. Alternately, you get to someone else within those 7 additional officials, and you say, I think based on what I know that they do and the types of records that they produce, I don't think that they should be included. And this is a process that you would continue to do around the diagram. All right, so far we've kind of centered the discussion on the accounts and roles of trying to choose people at the top of your agency. However, there are other accounts that should be considered. And this would include accounts from offices that routinely create permanent records or offices that formulate or implement policy. This also would include accounts that are associated to certain programs or initiatives rather than a person. A great example with this would be if your agency has an email account that they use for soliciting public comments, and maybe it's public comments at agency.gov. You could, as an agency, decide to include that in your capstone accounts because maybe those emails are already permanent anyways. All right, and our last bullet of accounts that you should be thinking about for inclusion is because Capstone is role-based, all accounts that are used by or on behalf of a Capstone official must be included. So if we want to use NARA again as an example, David Ferriero is the archivist, so he might have david.ferriero@nara.gov as one email account. He also might have Archivist of the U.S. at nara.gov as another email account. He might also have a classified account, and he could also have another account that maybe he uses internally. All of those accounts would need to be included and accounted for because they go back to his role as Archivist of the United States. All right, so we've discussed how you would determine your permanent accounts. So the next question, of course, is, well, what do I do with the rest of it? So agencies have the opportunity under the Capstone approach to include temporary email accounts in their implementation. There are, however, going to be some different concerns that you might have for temporary. So you want to make sure that you include all your stakeholders, and you want to make sure that you listen to any concerns that they might have. Because with temporary accounts, you'd be destroying them rather than keeping them. You may find that they have different concerns. So the main decision for temporary accounts really has to do with determining the retention length for those accounts and making sure that it will meet your agency's business and legal needs. So you may find that one retention length is appropriate for all of your email accounts. If you talk to everyone in your offices, they all seem to be in agreement that 5 years will work for them. Alternately, you could talk to your different offices, and you could get several different numbers, and some of your offices may really feel that they need to have their email records for a certain length of time that differs from another office. So in that example, you could have actually multiple temporary items or multiple temporary buckets, and that would be acceptable under the Capstone approach. So to kind of sum up this section a little bit, I want to run through just kind of a really simple scenario that I think, or I'm hoping will help visualize what these items might look like on paper. So what we have is we have an agency that has decided to implement a Capstone approach. They've figured out and determined their Capstone accounts. They know that they want to include temporary accounts, and they've talked to all of their offices, and it seems that their requirements fall anywhere from 3 to 15 years. And of course, this agency has talked to all of their stakeholders, and they've determined any concerns or issues that they might have. So in this scenario, the disposition proposal would look something like the two items that we have below. We've got bucket 1, which would be all permanent Capstone accounts, and in the description for this item, you would include the roles and positions that would be included in that account. And then you would also have your transfer instructions like you normally create, which would say ultimately transfer to NARA. And then for this scenario, we've got bucket 2, which is all temporary non-Capstone accounts. And the description for this item could actually be that simple because your permanent account would have already would be more specific and would be more inclusive. And then because of this scenario, this agency has decided that they're going to destroy their email at 15 years. They've decided that they want to take the longest retention for the needs of their agency. All right, and so that little scenario actually leads us directly into our next section, which is in obtaining disposition authority. So records that are managed under a Capstone approach do require a Capstone-specific disposition authority. So this means that agencies must submit a record schedule. NARA is actually considering the viability of a GRS for the Capstone approach. At this time, we're still in the process of determining that viability. Some agencies may find that they're able to work out their implementation details faster than others. Maybe it only takes them 4 months because their system is very conducive to doing this process. And so in a scenario like that, I would suggest that you talk to your appraisal archivist and you discuss with them about how you might go about submitting a schedule for your records. Alternately, we may find that we know at that point if we'll be going forward with the GRS or not, and so then they could advise you as to what would be the appropriate course of action. I suspect for many of you, though, that you may not have that as quick of a process, and so maybe it will take you 6 months or maybe a little bit longer, especially if you decide to maybe buy a new email platform. There's a certain amount of rollout with that. But either way, your appraisal archivist is a great resource for you, and they will advise you when you are ready to seek disposition authority as to what would be the best route for you to go. And that actually brings us to our last section, which is on tools and resources. As I think we've already mentioned, NARA is considering additional tools that we're hoping will help everyone with the implementation of Capstone. 2 of these that we're thinking of doing is issuing a technical requirements checklist, and as I believe Sean already mentioned, we're also hoping to do lessons learned presentations from agencies who've already implemented it. And we are hoping that NARA will be the first one to do this. We're working on that and hoping that you all will hear something more about that soon. But we're also looking into other resources. We definitely want to support this approach, and we're looking to see what else we can issue that will help you guys. In other related resources, NARA is going to be issuing new format guidance, and it does include a section on email, so please be on the lookout for that. NARA does have guidelines concerning pre-accessioning, so we encourage you to look at that and see if it would be advantageous for your agency for your permanent accounts. And then, of course, there's always NARA's records management pages on archives.gov. We have a new page called Email Management, which is right off of our main records management page, and that is actually where you can access these slides and all of the handouts from today. It's also where we will be posting additional resources as they become available. Another resource that we did add it to the slides, and that is the Electronic Records Management Automation Working Group. They've been coordinating a series of free demos, different vendor demos, over the last couple of months. And I think we've actually gotten some really good feedback on that, so I encourage you to check those out if you think that that would be useful to you. And as always, contact your agency's NARA appraisal archivist if you have any other questions or concerns, or you're not sure where to start. And that actually brings us to the end of our presentation. So I would like to open up the floor now to questions on anything that we've talked about.
We hope that you found this seminar useful. For more information about the U.S. National Archives and Records Administration National Training Program, please visit us online at nara.learn.com.